why should we think in the first place that we should be trying to reduce mind, intelligence, agency, or any of these other things to the physical world? What's our justification? What is our justification for that? So why should anybody care to search for an explanation of intelligence, agency, or consciousness? Why should they think that these are explainable in physical terms rather than in just the familiar terms that we use, that we take ourselves to understand ourselves intuitively? And I think the answer to these questions of why we try to fit our intuitive understanding of our own intelligence and agency into the scientific image, like the answers to why we pursue other foundational scientific questions, are at least twofold. On the one hand, success in these projects generally leads to significant epistemological benefits. We gain a deeper and richer understanding of the kinds of beings we are, and a deeper understanding than we get just from thinking of ourselves using distinctively mental concepts. Additionally, these reductionistic projects often lead to practical benefits and are having the ability to create other kinds of intelligences, other kinds of agents, or to enhance our own mental features, our own intelligence, our own agency. And we can also use these kinds of reductionistic explanations to evaluate the question of whether other beings we encounter, animals, artificial intelligences, or others we might encounter in the future, like extraterrestrials, have these features as well. So much of my work has been engaged not so much with the epistemological and practical benefits that these projects accrue, but rather with whether there's a metaphysical framework that can support the success of these projects. And the framework that's most often discussed in this context is that of materialism, or what most philosophers today would call physicalism. And simply, that's just the view, the way I like to understand it, is that physics is the fundamental science. This was, interestingly, a rather minority view until well into the first part of the 20th century, but it's certainly more widely adopted today. And what I'd like to do here is discuss this framework when I find, when interpreted properly, a reasonable framework. We should think that physics is a fundamental science. But I want to show that the most common way of describing what this metaphysical framework comes to is problematic and rests on some obvious mistakes, mainly about the character of our actual physical theories. And this has led some, actually many in philosophy of science, to say we should give up on physicalism altogether. We should give up on the view that physics is a fundamental science. But for reasons I've discussed elsewhere, I think this is a really bad route to take. I think that we should try to hold firm and claim that physics is fundamental. We should keep to the idea that physics has a privileged status amongst the sciences, at least in terms of its ability to provide a certain class of explanations. And so this is a kind of important framework, not just for the mind-body problem, the problem of fitting free will into a deterministic or indeterministic physics, but more broadly as a metaphysical framework for raising physical questions. So coming back to the question I raised at the start of the talk, what's the answer most philosophers, perhaps most scientists generally, I don't know, I'd like to take a poll, would give to the question of why it's reasonable to try to explain mental phenomena in physical terms. For philosophers, the answer is because we live in an exhaustively physical world, because our world is exhaustively, fundamentally physical. And so the answer is because physicalism is true. I'll say David Chalmers and David Bourget actually conducted a survey about what philosophers think about this question. They did a wide-ranging survey in 2009 asking them, one of the questions was mind, physicalism or non-physicalism. And I was surprised it was so low, but it was still a majority of philosophers, 56%, accepted or leaned towards physicalism. And he's going to do a new survey now. I think that physicalism, the view that physics is fundamental, is actually on the wane in philosophy, but we'll see. You're doing a new survey in 2019, maybe, this year? Okay. So if physicalism is a view that our world is exhaustively, fundamentally physical, then what does this mean? Well, it's standard, and I would argue it's reasonable. It's the only kind of reasonable way to interpret this, is to understand the physical in terms of physics. So physicalism is a view that the world is fundamentally the way physics says it is. But there's a well-known problem with this interpretation, and this is one that was formulated first, to my knowledge, by Carl Hempel. So here's Hempel. This is what's called Hempel's dilemma now. And this is a quote from a review article of Nelson Goodman's book, The Ways of World Making. He says, the physicalistic claim that the language of physics can serve as a unitary language of science is inherently obscure. The language of what physics is meant. Surely not that of, say, 18th century physics, for it contains terms like caloric fluid, whose use is governed by theoretical assumptions, now thought false. Nor can the language of contemporary physics claim the role of unitary language, since it will no doubt undergo further changes too. The thesis of physicalism would seem to require a language in which a true theory of all physical phenomena can be formulated, but it's quite unclear what's understood to be meant here by a physical phenomenon. I just want to say, when Hempel's talking here about a unitary language, this is a kind of terminology coming from Carnap and the logical positivists. He's asking, what is the kind of language we should use to formulate a unified science? So this clearly relates to reductionistic projects of the kind we're talking about today. Now this, as I said, is what's commonly known as Hempel's dilemma, and in contemporary terms, the problem's supposed to be that if physicalism is formulated as a claim that the world is fundamentally the way past or current physical theory says it is, then it's obviously false. But if it's formulated in terms of the true physical theory, well, since we don't yet have such a theory, it's going to be some future physics. It's hard to know what the theory says. And so some philosophers, Daniel Stolger, Hugh Mellor, and Tim Crane, for example, have taken this dilemma to indicate that physicalism is, in Crane and Mellor's terms, the wrong answer to an essentially trivial question. And others reject physicalism for reasons I'll discuss in a bit. But the majority who have engaged with this dilemma don't think it's really a problem. And so this is the first, my title was Two Physicalisms. This is the first physicalism I'm going to discuss here. It's an attempt to embrace the second horn of this dilemma. Okay, so this is sometimes referred to in the philosophical literature as futurism, because it interprets physicalism as a view that the world is fundamentally the way the true future completed physics says it is. So what's the fundamental science? It's some future true completed physics. So for example, David Lewis defined physicalism as the view that something not too different from present-day physics, so presumably somewhat improved, is a comprehensive theory of the world, complete as well as correct. And similarly, Barry Lower is somebody who uses this interpretation of physicalism to say, physicalism claims all facts obtained in virtue of the distribution of fundamental entities and properties, whatever they turn out to be, of completed fundamental physics. Lewis's proposal aims to navigate between the two horns of the dilemma, but the trouble, of course, is that if it's true, as it seems, that physics is some revolutions away from completeness, or worse, that there's no good reason to believe there'll ever be a completed physics, then the move to this something not too different from physics obviously doesn't help to avoid the dilemma. Now, there's several complaints that people could raise about physicalism construed in this way, the way it's typically argued. And there's a really nice paper by the philosopher Barbara Montero called The Body Problem, where she outlines the very many problems with understanding physicalism this way and in kind of nearby related ways. But I really think these two issues, the one initially raised by Hempel and this last point about us lacking any good reason to believe there will be a completed physics, are the most damaging to the interpretation. So let me say a little bit more, since what's been written on this topic hasn't really convinced, it doesn't seem to be convincing. So I'm just going to underline my kind of concerns about this. And I think I should say, it seems to me that when people say that physics is a fundamental science, it's not just the philosophers that kind of interpret this as saying there will be a completed physical theory that will explain everything. I think this is a really common interpretation of this. All right, so the two main concerns I have with this interpretation of the view that physics is fundamental, or physicalism, is that futurist physicalism says the physical is whatever some final completed physics says there is, but even if physics eventually will be completed and reach a true and final theory, if physics has to undergo several revolutions before it's completed, then we don't know now what these future physical things are. So futurist physicalism fails to provide any positive content for the view to serve as a guide for scientific or other explanatory projects. The view is only interesting because it provides a framework for understanding our world at the fundamental levels and also guides research programs into the non-fundamental levels. It guides one towards certain views about what there is, and rather than others, towards certain kinds of forms of reductive explanations or strategies for engineering, but it can't serve these purposes if we have no idea what the physical is supposed to be. Second, without the assumption that there will be a future completed physics, futurist physicalism is vacuous. There's no meaning for what future completed physics is. There is no such thing. So the view is just completely, lacks meaning. It's vacuous. But we have no positive justification for thinking there ever will be a completed physical theory. So let me just briefly give an argument for this. So just to be clear, I'm not saying there will be no completed physics. I'm just saying there is no argument for saying that. So we shouldn't be basing this kind of position on such a claim. So the first premise of the argument is there's no deductive argument. There's no deductive argument leading us to believe there will ever be a completed physics. Logic or the meaning of the terms physics and complete alone don't compel us to believe that physics will one day be complete. So that means that the only good argument there could be for believing there will be a completed physics would be some kind of inductive argument. But there's no good inductive argument for this claim either. And this is because the way inductive arguments work is by noting that there's some cases that have some similarity in common, and they all turned out to be a certain way, so we should think that everything that has that kind of similarity to the first objects will also have that feature. So for example, we've seen a raven, it's black, we see another raven, it's black, right? These things are all ravens, so we infer all ravens are black. In this case, to give an inductive argument for the claim that there will be a completed physics, we'd have to say something like, we observed this thing, we explained it physically, we observed this thing, we explained it physically, therefore we'll explain everything physically. But the problem is there's no class of similarity to support the induction in this case. Since we're talking about everything and anything, there's no similarity class like there was in the case when we talked about ravens, so there's going to be no good inductive argument here. So since there's neither a good deductive nor inductive argument for the claim that there'll one day be a completed physics, it would be better to interpret physicalism in such a way that's independent of this completeness assumption. So how can physicalism be interpreted in a way that adequately frames projects for locating mental phenomena in a physical world? A starting point would be to look for physicalism that's actually useful for these kinds of projects, not just as a doctrine about the kinds of things that the world contains, but rather as a framework for scientific progress. Now, physicalism is often conflated with materialism, a doctrine that says there's fundamentally only one kind of stuff, matter. But what I'm trying to highlight is the fact that even if it's true that there is fundamentally, it turns out, there's only one kind of stuff, we don't at this stage know what it is, and this wouldn't really present us with any kind of useful framework for discovery and explanation. One insight of Carnap and the logical positivists was to dispense with these questions of what kind of stuff is a universe made of, and instead worry about what kinds of frameworks are useful for scientific purposes of prediction, explanation, control, but not only for these purposes, but also for social purposes. So there's a really nice paper from Peter Gallison in 1990 called Aufbau Bauhaus that gets into this more. And this is something that Hempel himself took up even before he proposed that dilemma in 1980. And it's a point of view that's been advocated by Bostrom Frossen, who suggests that we take physicalism not as a doctrine about the kinds of things the world contains, but rather as an attitude or a stance. So here's Van Frossen in 2002 in his book, The Empirical Stance. He says, whenever philosophers take some general feature of physics and use it to identify what's material, what happens? Physics soon goes on to describe things that lack that feature and are altogether different. When that happens, does materialism bite the dust? Surely not. If the physicalist or naturalist part of this philosophical position is mainly the desire or commitment to have metaphysics guided by physics, then it's something that cannot be captured in any thesis or factual belief. It's not identifiable with a theory about what there is, but only with an attitude or a cluster of attitudes. These attitudes include strong deference to the current content of science and matters of opinion of what there is. They include also an inclination and perhaps a commitment, at least an intention, to accept approximate completeness claims for science as actually constituted at any given time. So this last commitment to the completeness or approximate completeness of physics as it's actually constituted is something I disagree the physicalist needs to take up. I mean, that's one of my main points here. The physicalists only need to accept a weaker kind of explanatory maximality for current physics, not completeness or even approximate completeness. Physics, when I say kind of explanatory maximality, what I'm saying is we shouldn't be, when we say things like physics is fundamental, we shouldn't be conflating that with a claim about explanatory completeness, but we might, in order to argue for the position, explicate that in terms of some kind of explanatory maximality, where what I mean by maximality is that physics gives broader, deeper, and more precise explanations than any other mode of inquiry. In particular, it's been successful at providing a broad class of reductive explanations of more complex systems, including those underlying the process of interest to us when we discuss biological systems that have intelligence and agency. And it can do that while being very far from completeness. All right, so Hempel's dilemma for physicalism, as we saw, has motivated some philosophers to give up the claim that physics is fundamental. But I want to point out that this is completely avoided on this way of taking physicalism to be an attitude rather than a doctrine that the world is the way the final completed theory says. The position interprets physics as current physics, right? So it goes to the first horn of the dilemma, but then it denies that it's just, we should take it to be the claim that the current physics as it stands is complete and true. Rather, it's an attitude that we should prefer metaphysical frameworks and reductionist models that are based on our current physical theories. One other good thing that I want to shift to talk about, instead of this dilemma that I've been talking about, is that there's been a big shift in the way that philosophers have thought about scientific explanation, the structure of theories. And one advantage of shifting to this way of thinking about physicalism, the view that physics is fundamental, is that it's also able to live peacefully with the kinds of views about modeling, scientific modeling and explanation that have gained more traction in the philosophy of science since the late 20th century. I said earlier that physicalism is a majority position in philosophy today, but this is, I think, because it's a position adopted by most metaphysicians, philosophers of mind, ethicists, and other people who are trying to fit parts of our world like normativity, mental phenomena, and so on into the physical picture. This is kind of like part of their research program. But it's become much of a less common view among philosophers of science. And I think one reason is simply due to the fact that there are a lot more philosophers of biology, philosophers of chemistry, and other philosophers of special sciences now. It's not like the field isn't dominated by philosophers of physics as it was in the past. But even among philosophers of physics, I see that there's like distancing from the claim that physics is fundamental or any kind of physicalism. And there are several reasons for this rejection of physicalism in the philosophy of science community as I see it. So I want to talk about those a little bit and why I don't think that they should be taken to undermine this kind of view. They're based all on reasonable premises, but they don't really undermine, as I see it, any claim about physicalism. So there are several reasonable claims that have caused philosophers of science to back away from physicalism. And I take many of these to mark the important lessons, like the important milestones of late 20th century philosophy of science. And they're really important for us to recognize, like these are big, important things, shifts in our understanding of science that we learned. The views of philosophers of science are not like the views of the logical positivists of the early and mid 20th century. So I'm just going to give a sample of these arguments and why people have thought that they kind of lead against the view that physics is fundamental, that kind of come from different parts of philosophy of science. So from general philosophy, traditional philosophy of science, there's a claim that sometimes the best explanation of a phenomenon is not the physical explanation, but rather some higher level or special science explanation. So the kind of famous case, one of the famous cases here that's really intuitive is Hilary Putnam's case of the peg in the hole. So Putnam says, if you want to know why this particular peg doesn't fit in this hole, one thing you can do is you could give a complete microphysical description of the peg and the hole, and then explain in those terms why it doesn't go through. But a much better explanation would be to say that the peg is square, the hole is circular, and that's why it doesn't go through. So the claim there, the idea is supposed to be that physics doesn't always give the best explanation. And, okay, so that's kind of one, so we shouldn't think it's fundamental. A second this is more from the philosophy of science and practice. It's noted that physicists rarely try to formulate theories of everything from which we could derive all true facts of the universe, but they mostly try to model some local phenomenon or others. And from this, it's often claimed that physics is just another of the special sciences. It's not special, it's not the fundamental or general science. So Nancy Cartwright is somebody who's pushed this view, but lots of others also. Laura Ritchie has her locavorism. Finally, from feminist philosophy of science, who also have these kinds of critiques of the view that physics is fundamental, coming in a very different way from a political perspective, saying, look, claims of the fundamentality of one science over another, not just physics, but also evolutionary biology, have led to a dangerous monopolization of resources. These might be better used on projects that maybe don't attract so much funding because they're not seen as fundamental, so we should stop thinking of particular sciences as fundamental. Now, I think that all of these, like I said, these are milestones in recent philosophy of science. They're important lessons. But they don't strike against the view that physics is fundamental, or physicalism, at least in the way that I've discussed it. The first argument doesn't really strike against either of the kind of ways of understanding physicalism that I've talked about here. Here, I think it's just really important to be careful that when we talk about fundamental explanations, we're not saying these are the most important explanations. In ordinary talk, fundamental, if I say this is a fundamental issue, I mean it's the important issue. But in this case, we need to be clear about what we're saying. We're saying physics is able to give a lot of reductive explanations, deep explanations, precise explanations, and so on. This is all that's meant by fundamental. It doesn't mean they're most important or we should be eliminating other explanations. The second point, I think this is actually very damaging to the traditional way of understanding physicalism, or the view that physics is fundamental, as the claim that there is this explanatorily complete physics that we're going to get at. If this isn't what physicists are doing, if they're working on little problems, there's no reason to think these will ever have to or should be pieced together into a final complete theory. Then the claim that the world is the way this completed future physics says it is just going to be vacuous. And so this is a good reason to, but at the same time, this second kind of concern with physicalism doesn't undermine the physicalist attitude, as I've said, because that only relies on the success, depth, maximality of physical explanations, not their completeness. And finally, I guess I'll close with this because I've got a zero and a frowning face. The social issues raised by claims of the fundamentality of physics are important to consider, and we shouldn't dismiss them. I think it's a real challenge for the physicalist to think through what the fundamentality of physics does imply for the privileging of certain research projects over others. But it's possible, of course, to say a lot about the practical benefits that come with the funding of projects, even the really expensive and abstract esoteric projects in physics. However, it's difficult to even begin to formulate that issue if you're thinking about the fundamentality of physics in terms of the truth or completeness of some distant, unknown, maybe never even existing theory. So thank you.